As we arrived at my nephew Andrew's birthday party, I couldn't help but notice how the mood shifted when Samantha walked in. She always had this presence about her, something magnetic, that drew eyes. I had grown used to it over the years, knowing that her beauty was undeniable, and at 27, she still had that youthful glow that could turn heads. I, on the other hand, had hit 42, and though I never felt insecure about our age difference, moments like this reminded me of it. Andrew, now 19, was standing by the door as we entered, his eyes lighting up when he saw Samantha. There was an unmistakable look of admiration in his gaze. He'd always liked her, maybe a little too much, but I chalked it up to typical teenage infatuation. It wasn't the first time I had seen him act that way around her, but today, it seemed more intense. Throughout the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew's eyes lingered on Samantha longer than they should. She was wearing that sleek red dress that hugged her figure just right, the one I had bought her for a night out some time ago. It was modest but elegant, with just enough to make anyone look twice. I didn't blame Andrew for looking, but there was something in the way he stared that made me uncomfortable. He wasn't just admiring her beauty, there was a hunger in his eyes, a desire that was hard to miss. Samantha, for her part, didn't seem to notice. She was her usual charming self, laughing and engaging with everyone at the party, including Andrew. I watched them from across the room, trying to focus on the conversations around me, but I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to them. Andrew stood close to her, his body language almost too casual as he leaned in slightly every time she spoke, his eyes never leaving her face. As the night went on, I found myself growing more uneasy. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just harmless attention from a young man who didn't know better. But as I watched Andrew, the way his gaze lingered on Samantha's every move, it became harder to ignore. At one point, I saw them standing by the drinks table, talking quietly. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Andrew was smiling, a little too confidently for my liking. Samantha laughed, her hand brushing lightly against his arm as she reached for a glass. It was an innocent gesture, but in that moment, it felt like something more. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to have. Was it all in my head? Was I just being paranoid? After all, Samantha was my wife, and I trusted her. But that didn't change the fact that I could see the way Andrew looked at her, the way he seemed to hang on her every word, his eyes following her like a shadow. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, I found myself watching Samantha and Andrew more closely. They stood together again, near the door this time, and I could see Andrew's face lit up with that same look of admiration. Samantha, ever the social butterfly, seemed oblivious to it all, laughing and chatting with him like it was any other conversation. But I knew better. It was late by the time we left the party. As we drove home, Samantha was her usual self, chatting about the party, how much fun she had, and how great it was to see everyone. I nodded along, my mind still replaying the moments between her and Andrew. I didn't say anything, not yet. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But one thing was for sure, Andrew's eyes had been on her the entire night, and it wasn't just admiration. It was something more, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. And now, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Samantha reached over and squeezed my hand, smiling at me as we pulled into the driveway. "You okay?" she asked, her voice light, as if everything was perfectly normal. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." But inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had changed something, something subtle, but real. And as much as I tried to push it aside, I knew I couldn't ignore it for long. As we pulled into the driveway, Samantha was still buzzing from the night. She leaned back in her seat, the soft glow of the streetlight illuminating her face as she looked over at me with that familiar, relaxed smile. "Oh, by the way," she said, almost casually, as if she just remembered something, "Andrew asked me if I could help him with his Italian." I glanced at her, not sure if I had heard her correctly. "Italian?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of surprise. She nodded, still smiling. Yeah, apparently he's really interested in learning it. He said it might help him with some future plans, maybe a trip or something. She chuckled softly. I guess he remembered that I teach it at the high school and thought I could give him some pointers. Samantha had been a teacher for several years now, fluent in both Spanish and Italian, and she always had a way of drawing people in with her passion for languages. It wasn't unusual for friends or family to ask her for help, but something about this didn't sit right with me. So, you're going to teach him? I asked, trying to keep my tone even. She shrugged lightly. Yeah, why not? He seemed pretty eager to learn, and it's not like I'm doing anything over the summer break. It could be fun. I nodded slowly, turning the key to kill the engine, but my mind was already spinning. Andrew had always been a smart kid, and I could see how he might want to learn a new language. But after the way he had acted at the party, his eyes constantly on Samantha, I couldn't help but feel uneasy about the whole thing. Maybe it was just me overreacting, reading too much into it. But the idea of him spending even more time with Samantha, alone, made my stomach twist. When would you be doing this? I asked, trying to sound casual as I unclipped my seatbelt. Oh, probably a couple of times a week, she replied, as if it were no big deal. We haven't set a schedule yet, but he said afternoons would work best for him. Afternoons. The thought of Andrew sitting alone with Samantha in the quiet of the afternoon while I was at work sent a strange feeling through me. Samantha didn't seem to notice my sudden quiet. Instead, she was already planning the lessons in her head, talking about how she'd start with the basics, building up his vocabulary and grammar over time. He's such a bright kid, she added as we walked to the front door. I think he'll pick it up quickly. I managed a small smile, trying to shake the nagging thoughts in my head. Of course, she thought Andrew was bright, he was her nephew, after all. But tonight had already shown me a different side of him, one that had a keen interest in more than just learning Italian. I tried to tell myself that it was all innocent, that Samantha was just helping family, and Andrew was just a curious young man eager to learn. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, the images of Andrew's gaze fixed on Samantha kept replaying in my mind. The way he had lingered near her all night, how easily he had laughed with her, how close he stood every time they talked, it all started to make sense now. He had found a way to get closer to her, to spend more time with her, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Samantha rolled over in her sleep, her soft breathing filling the quiet of the room, but I remained awake, my thoughts swirling. Was I being too suspicious? Was it just my own insecurity rearing its head? After all, Samantha was devoted to me. We had been through so much together, and I had no reason to doubt her loyalty. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew had other intentions, ones that went beyond simply learning a new language. I turned onto my side, watching Samantha as she slept peacefully beside me. She had no idea what was going through my head, no idea that the simple mention of teaching Andrew Italian had opened up a floodgate of worries I hadn't expected. Tomorrow, I'd have to figure out how to deal with this. For now, though, I just lay there, hoping that my instincts were wrong, but knowing deep down that I couldn't ignore what I had seen. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the thought of Samantha and Andrew's upcoming lessons was never far from my mind. I tried to push it aside, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just Italian lessons between family. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had noticed a certain excitement in Samantha's voice when she talked about helping Andrew, but I chalked it up to her love of teaching. Maybe that was all it was. Then, the day came for their first lesson. I had been at work, trying to focus on the mountain of tasks on my desk, but my mind kept drifting back home. What were they doing right now? Was Andrew being respectful, or was he giving her that same look he'd given her at the party? I imagined them sitting at the kitchen table, going over Italian verbs, and I felt a knot tightening in my chest. By the time I left the office, I was anxious to get home. I had no reason to be worried, but something about the whole situation gnawed at me. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Samantha's car parked in its usual spot, but Andrew's was gone. He must have left already. I stepped into the house, setting down my keys and briefcase, and immediately noticed something on the kitchen counter that made my heart skip a beat. A bouquet of flowers. Bright, beautiful, freshly picked. They sat there in a glass vase, right in the center of the table where Samantha and Andrew had likely spent their afternoon. The sight of them hit me like a punch to the gut. I walked over, staring at the flowers, my mind racing. I knew I hadn't given them to her. Which meant Andrew had. Why would he bring flowers? My stomach twisted with jealousy, that familiar burning sensation creeping up my spine. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just a polite gesture, but I couldn't stop the flood of suspicions rushing through my mind. A simple thank you for the lessons, perhaps. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I knew what this looked like, and it wasn't innocent. I was still standing there, staring at the flowers, when Samantha walked in from the other room. She smiled when she saw me, her eyes lighting up like they always did. But this time, I couldn't return the smile. "Hey," she said, walking over to me and kissing me on the cheek. "How was your day?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "It was fine. Busy." My eyes flicked back to the flowers. "What's with the flowers?" "Oh, those?" Samantha glanced at them with a casual smile. "Andrew brought them as a thank you for the lessons. Wasn't that sweet?" Sweet. That's what she called it. But all I could see was a young man trying to get closer to my wife, using any excuse he could find. I forced a smile, but inside, I was boiling. "Yeah, real sweet." Samantha didn't seem to notice the tension in my voice. She moved to the stove, checking on whatever she had cooking for dinner, her back to me as she continued talking about how the lesson had gone. I barely heard her, my mind stuck on those flowers, on Andrew's audacity to bring them into my house. Into our house. And he picked up the basics pretty quickly, Samantha was saying, her voice light and casual. "I think he's really serious about learning. We might even try to meet twice a week if his schedule allows." Twice a week? My mind reeled. It was bad enough that he had spent the afternoon alone with her, now he was angling for more? I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to keep my composure. I couldn't just come out and accuse her of anything. There was no proof, no real reason for me to doubt her. But those flowers sitting there on the kitchen counter felt like a giant red flag, a symbol of something more. "Twice a week, huh?" I said, my voice a little too tight. "Seems like he's pretty eager." Samantha didn't pick up on the edge in my tone. She just laughed softly. "Yeah, I guess so. It's nice to see someone so motivated to learn." I nodded, forcing myself to walk away from the flowers, but the jealousy was already bubbling up inside me. I went upstairs to change out of my work clothes, but my mind was still downstairs, stuck on the image of Andrew handing those flowers to Samantha, smiling at her in that way he had at the party. Was this really all just about Italian lessons? Or was Andrew using this as an excuse to get closer to her, to spend more time with her? And what about Samantha? Was she really that oblivious to his intentions? Or worse, was there a part of her that enjoyed the attention? I tried to shake the thoughts from my head, but they stuck, lingering like a dark cloud over the rest of the evening. Every time I walked past the kitchen, my eyes flicked back to those flowers, a constant reminder that Andrew had been here, in my home, alone with my wife. And for the first time in our marriage, I felt an unfamiliar sense of doubt creeping in. I didn't say anything to Samantha that night. But as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I knew I couldn't let this go. I needed to figure out what was really going on between them. Whether it was all in my head or if there was something more beneath the surface. And those flowers? They were the first crack in the foundation. That night, I went to bed with my mind still swirling with doubts and suspicions. The flowers sat in the kitchen like a silent witness to something I couldn't fully understand, but couldn't shake off either. I wanted to believe that everything was innocent, that Samantha was just being her usual, generous self, and that Andrew's gesture was nothing more than a polite thank you. But deep down, something didn't sit right. I tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, images of the day kept flashing through my mind: Samantha and Andrew sitting together, laughing, talking, him staring at her like he had at the party. And then, those flowers, bright and bold on our kitchen counter, a physical reminder of Andrew's presence in our home. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep, my thoughts still tangled in jealousy and suspicion. But as I slept, the uneasy feeling followed me into my dreams. I found myself in our living room. Everything looked normal at first. Samantha was sitting on the couch, her usual spot, smiling at me. But then, as if out of nowhere, Andrew appeared. He stood close to her, closer than I would have liked, and the way he looked at her sent a shiver down my spine. Samantha's expression changed too. She wasn't just smiling anymore, there was something different, something sultry in the way she looked at him. My dream self wanted to say something, to stop whatever was happening, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching helplessly as the scene unfolded in front of me. Then, in the dream, I heard Samantha speak. Her voice was soft, seductive, dripping with an unfamiliar sensuality that made my skin crawl. "Andrew," she purred, her tone slow and teasing, as if she were savoring his name. "My smart student, come to me." My heart raced, pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't stop her. Andrew stepped closer to her, a smug smile on his face, and Samantha reached out, her hand brushing against his arm, just like she had done at the party, but this time with an unmistakable intimacy. I tried to yell, to shout, to do anything, but it was like I was trapped, unable to intervene, stuck watching as my wife invited him in, as if I wasn't even there. Her voice echoed in my head, that sultry whisper repeating over and over again. "Andrew, my smart student, come to me." Suddenly, I woke up. My heart was pounding, my body covered in a cold sweat. I sat up in bed, breathing heavily, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. I looked over at Samantha, who was fast asleep beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful, completely unaware of the turmoil that had just gripped me. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a stupid dream. But the lingering feeling of dread wouldn't leave. Her voice from the dream still echoed in my head, sending shivers down my spine. The way she had spoken Andrew's name, it had felt so real, so vivid. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, unable to calm my racing heart. I wanted to believe that it was nothing more than my subconscious playing tricks on me, feeding off the jealousy I'd been feeling all day. But part of me couldn't help but wonder, was there some truth hidden in that dream? Was my mind trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to face? I glanced at Samantha again, sleeping peacefully beside me, completely unaware of the storm that was raging inside me. She looked so innocent, so serene. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers, something I couldn't control. I lay back down, staring up at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But sleep didn't come easily after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again, calling out to Andrew in that sultry tone, drawing him closer. "Andrew, my smart student, come to me." And even though I was awake, it felt like the nightmare was far from over. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the dream, to the way Samantha had spoken Andrew's name with that seductive tone. It haunted me, leaving a knot of suspicion lodged deep in my chest. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than my imagination running wild, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The flowers, the dream, and Andrew's lingering stares, it all felt too connected. By mid-morning, I was exhausted, not just from lack of sleep, but from the mental strain of second-guessing everything. I couldn't take it anymore. A part of me needed reassurance, needed to see for myself that nothing was happening. Samantha had mentioned that Andrew's next lesson would be that afternoon, and I made a sudden decision. I'd come home early, under the guise of being too tired to work, and just see how things were going. It would put my mind at ease, or so I hoped. I left the office earlier than usual, telling my colleagues I was feeling a bit under the weather. As I drove home, the same thoughts circled in my mind, each one darker than the last. I tried to tell myself that everything was fine, that this was all just in my head. But the closer I got to home, the tighter my chest became. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Andrew's car parked outside, just as I expected. My heart began to race as I quietly opened the front door, stepping inside the house. It was eerily quiet. I tiptoed through the hallway, pausing when I noticed the sound of muffled voices coming from upstairs. My stomach twisted as I made my way up the stairs, the feeling of dread growing stronger with every step. As I reached the bedroom, the door was slightly ajar. I could hear soft laughter, but it wasn't the kind of laughter I'd expect from an Italian lesson. My breath caught in my throat as I gently pushed the door open, peering inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, on our bed, under the covers, was Andrew. His face was flushed, his eyes closed in what could only be described as pleasure. And then I saw Samantha. Her hand was moving rhythmically under the blanket. My heart pounded in my chest, disbelief and rage crashing over me like a tidal wave. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the woman I had loved and trusted for years did the unthinkable. The scene before me was like something out of a nightmare. Andrew, my nephew, enjoying himself on our bed, while Samantha's hand moved up and down his stick with a casual ease that made my stomach turn. For a moment, I thought I might be sick. The betrayal, the humiliation, it was all too much to process. I wanted to scream, to tear the covers off and confront them, but I couldn't move. It was as if my body had shut down, paralyzed by the shock of what I was witnessing. Samantha hadn't noticed me standing there, her focus entirely on Andrew, who was completely lost in the moment. I felt my hands ball into fists, my knuckles turning white as I tried to keep my emotions in check. But there was no keeping them in check. Not anymore. I stepped back, slowly retreating from the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't bear to look at them for another second. I stumbled down the stairs, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me, the image of what I had just seen burned into my mind. How could this have happened? How could she do this to me? To us? As I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest, a strange, conflicted thought entered my mind: I need proof. I couldn't just leave, couldn't just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it. This was something I'd never be able to explain to anyone without evidence. Proof was the only way to confront Samantha, to show her that I knew what she had done. Before I fully realized what I was doing, I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling as I opened the camera and hit record. My mind was still spinning from the shock of what I was witnessing, but my body seemed to move on autopilot. I aimed the phone through the crack in the door, capturing the scene on video: Andrew, lost in his pleasure, and Samantha, her hands still working him under the covers with an ease that made me feel sick to my core. But as the seconds ticked by, something strange happened. Amid the anger, the betrayal, and the overwhelming nausea, I felt something else, a stirring deep inside me that I didn't expect. My heart rate began to quicken, not just from the adrenaline or the anger, but from a strange, shameful excitement that I couldn't fully understand. It hit me hard. Here I was, watching my wife in the middle of a betrayal, and yet there was a part of me that felt drawn to the scene unfolding before me. It made no sense, and the realization of it left me reeling. I felt disgusted with myself, horrified that, despite everything, there was something about what I was seeing that stirred something primal inside me. I tried to push the feeling away, to focus on the betrayal, the humiliation, and the deep sense of anger that I had every right to feel. But my pulse was racing, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts, and no matter how much I tried to shake it off, the excitement clung to me like a shadow. My hands were still shaking as I continued to film, capturing every second of the sordid act playing out in front of me. I couldn't stop, not now. I needed the proof. But the more I filmed, the more I felt the mix of emotions swirling inside me: anger, disgust, and, to my shock, an undeniable spark of arousal. It made no sense. How could I feel this way in the middle of such a nightmare? It was a feeling I didn't want to acknowledge, something I tried to bury as I focused on getting the footage, but it was there, lingering beneath the surface, taunting me with its presence. I felt ashamed, like I had somehow crossed a line just by being there, by watching, by filming. But I couldn't stop. I needed this proof. As I stood there, my phone still recording the betrayal unfolding in front of me, something inside me shifted. The strange excitement that had been building in the pit of my stomach began to overwhelm me, growing stronger by the second. My mind, in some twisted attempt to cope with the surrealness of the situation, started to drift into an unexpected fantasy, one where it wasn't Andrew in bed with Samantha, but me. I tried to push the thought away, to refocus on the betrayal, on the anger I had every right to feel. But the image of me in Andrew's place, Samantha's hand moving up and down on me with the same intimacy, took root in my mind. It felt wrong, so incredibly wrong, and yet I couldn't stop myself from imagining it. The more I thought about it, the more intense the feeling became. My pulse quickened, and my breath grew shallow. I was lost, caught between the harsh reality of what was happening and this strange, forbidden fantasy that was playing out in my head. I could almost feel Samantha's touch, as though it were me she was pleasing in that moment, not Andrew. It was overwhelming, intoxicating in a way that made my body betray me. Without warning, the excitement surged through me, stronger than I'd ever expected. My body responded in a way that left me shocked and ashamed, but I couldn't stop it. Before I knew it, I felt the wave of release, an intense climax washing over me right there in the hallway, as I stood in the doorway filming them. I bit my lip, trying to stifle any sound, my heart racing from the combination of disbelief, shame, and undeniable pleasure. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The reality of the situation came crashing down around me, leaving me both physically and emotionally spent, and more confused than ever. How could I have let this happen? How could I have been turned on by something that should have filled me with nothing but rage and disgust? I stood there, frozen, my phone still in my hand, the video still recording. The excitement faded quickly, replaced by an overwhelming sense of guilt and confusion. I felt dirty, ashamed, not just of what I had seen, but of how my own body had reacted. This wasn't how I was supposed to feel. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to happen. But now, there was no going back. I had the proof I needed, but I also had the weight of my own shocking response to deal with. In the aftermath of my overwhelming and confusing emotions, reality came crashing down on me like a freight train. The guilt, the anger, the betrayal, it all hit at once. I stood there, phone still in hand, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened, from what I had just witnessed, to my own unexpected reaction. I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I shoved the phone into my pocket, stormed into the room, and ripped the covers off the bed. The shock on both their faces was immediate. Andrew scrambled to sit up, panic flooding his expression, while Samantha gasped, her eyes wide in horror as she realized I had caught them in the act. "Jack," she started, her voice trembling, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. "Not now. Not after everything." I didn't say a word as I grabbed Andrew by the arm, yanking him off the bed with a force that surprised even me. He barely had time to react before I was dragging him across the room and toward the door. He stammered, trying to protest, but I didn't care. His words meant nothing to me. My mind was a blur of anger and adrenaline, and I just wanted him gone. I flung open the front door and shoved him outside, slamming the door behind him without looking back. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, my pulse still racing as the weight of everything pressed down on me. But the house was quiet now. Empty, except for me and Samantha. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My mind was still spinning, my body still tense from the chaotic mix of emotions I had just gone through. I didn't know what I was doing, or why, but in that moment, I felt an inexplicable pull back to the bedroom. Back to Samantha. When I walked back in, she was still sitting there on the bed, her eyes wide with shock and fear. I could see the guilt written all over her face, the way her hands trembled as she tried to cover herself, but something inside me had shifted. Instead of the fury I thought I would feel, there was something else, something I couldn't quite explain, but couldn't ignore. I didn't say a word as I climbed into bed beside her, the space between us now heavy with tension and unsaid words. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and regret, but I didn't care. I leaned in, my hands finding her skin, my body moving instinctively toward hers. Without hesitation, I kissed her, hard and full of a desperate need that surprised even me. I could feel her resistance at first, the shock still lingering, but soon she melted into the kiss, her body responding to mine as if nothing had happened. It was as though we were both trying to erase the memory of what had just occurred, as though we could fix everything in this one moment. I didn't think about Andrew. I didn't think about the betrayal, or the proof I had just recorded on my phone. All I could think about was Samantha, her body, her warmth, the familiar rhythm of us together. It was raw, urgent, and more intense than it had been in a long time. We moved together, our breaths quick and shallow, our movements desperate. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. For a brief, fleeting instant, the world outside of that bedroom ceased to exist. There was only me and Samantha, and the intensity of the moment we had created. But deep down, I knew that this wouldn't erase what had happened. It wouldn't change the reality of the situation, or the choices that had been made. But for now, I let myself get lost in it.